What if the ground beneath your feet is not as solid as you believe? What if the darkness is not empty, but occupied? The greatest terrors are not found in the forests or the shadows of old houses. They are found in the depths, in places where the sun is a memory, the air is a commodity, and every sound is a question of structural integrity. Places where men and women go to extract a living, and sometimes something else is extracted in return. This is verified nightmare, where every story is documented, every account is cross-referenced, and every nightmare is verified. Tonight, we descend. Our focus: 11 documented cases of horror from beneath the earth. These are not campfire tales of ghostly miners. These are incidents recorded in official mining commission reports, etched into the memories of survivors, and buried in the archives of companies that would prefer them forgotten. We have affidavits, geological surveys, and chilling first-hand testimony that confirm the events you are about to hear. We will examine cases where collapses were not accidents, where sounds in abandoned tunnels had no natural source, and where crews, isolated miles from the surface, encountered entities that should not exist. The common thread is the mine itself, a living, breathing, and often malicious geography that remembers every explosion, every casualty, and every intrusion. For the next several hours, we will be your guide into this absolute darkness. The stories are sequenced, building from isolated, strange occurrences to full-scale, system-wide catastrophes that defy conventional explanation. Before we begin, hit the subscribe button and enable notifications for verified nightmare. The world above is complicated enough. What waits below requires a channel dedicated solely to the truth. This is not just entertainment. It is a record, a warning, and for some, confirmation of their deepest fears. Our first story takes us to the Appalachian coalfields of West Virginia, in the autumn of 1987. It is a case known to a handful of inspectors and a single, traumatized crew. It is officially classified as a ventilation event and a mass hallucination due to oxygen depletion. The survivors tell a different story. They call it the case of the whistling shaft. The whistling shaft. David McCready was a section foreman with 17 years of experience in the Blackthorn No. 9 mine. He was a methodical man, known for his meticulous pre-shift safety checks and his unwavering calm during the routine stresses of deep coal extraction. His life, outside of the perpetual dust, was one of quiet domesticity in the town of Beckley. He repaired antique clocks as a hobby, a patient process of aligning tiny gears to restore order and function. The mine, to David, was simply a larger, darker clock. It had its rhythms, its pressures, and its known hazards. He respected it, but he did not fear it. The incident began not with a bang, but with the sound that shouldn't have been there. It was during the graveyard shift, in a newly opened section designated Panel 7 East. The continuous miner was chewing into a fresh coal face, its roar of familiar white noise to the six-man crew. It was Ronnie Hewitt, an electrician running a new power line, who first heard it. He shut off his drill and held up a hand, his lamp cutting through the particulate-filled air. "You hear that?" The others killed their machines. In the sudden, ringing silence, they heard it. A faint, melodic whistling. It was not the groan of rock or the hiss of an air vent. It was a tune, a simple, repeating sequence of 5 or 6 notes, carried on the cold, artificial breeze flowing from the deeper, unexplored tunnels at the panel's edge. It was distant, but clear. David's first assumption was a prank, perhaps a radio left on by a survey crew. But the frequency was wrong for static, and the tune was alien. Not a pop song or a folk melody. Something older, something hollow. David noted the time in his logbook, 2:17 a.m. He ordered a check of all personnel. Every man was accounted for. He then contacted the surface via the hardline phone. The dispatcher, an old hand named Frank, confirmed no other crews were within half a mile of their location, and no maintenance was scheduled. Frank's voice crackled over the line. "You're hearing things, Dave. Get some air." But the air readings David took were pristine. Oxygen at 20.9%, methane at 0%, carbon monoxide negligible. The atmosphere was, by every metric, safe. Over the next 3 shifts, the whistling became a fixture. It never grew louder, but it never ceased. It was always just at the edge of audibility, seeming to come from whichever tunnel was currently unoccupied. Crews began reporting tool malfunctions. Battery-powered helmet lamps, freshly charged, would die within an hour. Digital readouts on gas detectors would flicker and display gibberish. A brand new hydraulic jack refused to extend, its controls dead, until it was hauled back to the service bay on the surface, where it worked perfectly. The event that escalated the situation was documented in the foreman's log and the subsequent Misha incident report. A roof bolter named Carl Jeffries was working alone, securing the ceiling 60 feet from the main crew. His job was to drill into the shale and set bolts to prevent a collapse. His radio call to David was calm, but confused. "Foreman, the rock. It's soft, like I'm drilling into clay, and it's warm." David immediately ordered him back. As Jeffries began retracting his drill, the whistling stopped. For the first time in 72 hours, the mine was silent. Then, from the hole Jeffries had just drilled, a fine, black powder began to seep. Not coal dust, something finer like graphite. It fell in a lazy stream, defying the ventilation current, and pulled on the floor. When David and another miner reached Jeffries, they found him staring at the pile. His face was pale under the coal grime. "It smells like ozone," he said. "And burnt hair." David, following protocol, evacuated the panel. As the last man left, he swiped a sample of the black powder into an empty filter bag, sealing it. The reveal did not come from the mine itself, but from a laboratory. David, uneasy, had sent the powder sample to a private geologist friend at the state university, bypassing company channels. The analysis came back a week later. The substance was carbon-based, but amorphous, lacking the crystalline structure of coal or graphite. The geologist's note included with the report read, "David, this is peculiar. The isotopic ratios are all wrong. It's as if this material was subjected to extreme pressure and heat, far beyond what exists in that coal seam. Also, trace organics indicate, well, reads like decomposed biological matter, but not plant, animal, or human. Where did you get this?" Armed with this, David went to the site superintendent, demanding a full geological survey of the area beyond Panel 7 East. The company refused, citing cost. The official stance, as recorded in the internal memo, was that environmental anomalies had caused transient sensory disturbances in the crew. Panel 7 East was sealed with a concrete bulkhead. David McCready was transferred to a different mine, a clear punitive measure. The aftermath and verification lie in two conflicting records. The Mine Safety and Health Administration report lists the incident as non-injury, atmospheric anomaly resolved. The company archive contains an order for the bulkhead, citing unstable strata, but the Beckley Public Library holds the personal diaries of a surveyor named Elias P. Morgan, who mapped the Blackthorn seam in 1921. In an entry dated November 3rd, he writes, "The men refuse to work the eastern section. They speak of a whistling man in the deep cuts. Superstition, no doubt, but the core samples from that area are strange. Black as sin and soft to the touch. I recommended the vein be left fallow. Some doors are best left unopened." David McCready never entered a deep mine again. He took a surface job as a safety instructor. His wife told investigators that for years after, he would wake in the night, rigid, listening. When she asked what was wrong, he would only whisper, "Do you hear it?" The whistling, he claimed, followed him, not in the air, but in the settling of his old house, in the steam from a kettle, a 5-note tune, reminding him that he had drilled into something that was not rock, and it had noticed. To this day, the concrete bulkhead in the abandoned Blackthorn No. 9 mine remains intact. But former employees who have worked in adjacent seams, under sworn testimony, report that during quiet moments, if you press your ear to the coal, you can still hear it, a faint, melodic whistle, echoing down from a sealed panel that the company says holds nothing but unstable rock. The phantom shift of the Crimson Ledge copper mine. Anya Petrova was a structural engineer, a recent immigrant from Ukraine who took a job with the Western Atlas Mining Corporation to pay off her student debts. Her role was remote and analytical, reviewing seismic sensor data from the Crimson Ledge open-pit copper mine in Arizona. Her workstation was a sterile, climate-controlled trailer on the rim of the massive terrace pit, a canyon carved by human industry. She was a woman of numbers and graphs, her world defined by the clear, scrolling lines of geophone readouts that measured ground vibrations from blasting and excavation. The abnormal, to her, was a deviation in wavelength, a spike in amplitude, something quantifiable. The inciting incident was a routine data check on the morning of October 14th. The night shift blast, scheduled for 1:00 a.m., had gone off without reported issue. But as Anya scrolled through the playback from the sensor grid, she saw a series of smaller, rhythmic vibrations beginning at 3:02 a.m. and lasting for precisely 47 minutes. The pattern was not the sharp, decaying signature of an explosion. It was a steady, mechanical pulse. It matched, exactly, the seismic profile of the P&H 4100 electric rope shovel, the largest piece of equipment on site, capable of moving 100 tons of rock per scoop. But the shovel, designated Unit Number 3, was logged as being under maintenance in the lower yard. Its GPS transponder confirmed it was stationary all night. Anya assumed a sensor error. She ran diagnostics. All sensors reported optimal. She pulled the security footage from the cameras overlooking the pit's active depth, level 12. The time lapse for the period in question showed an empty excavation face, lit by towering light stanchions. No movement. Yet the seismic data insisted a machine the size of a building was actively digging. She cross-referenced with the dispatch radio logs. No calls, no traffic. The graveyard shift foreman, when she called him, sounded irritated and tired. Nothing was moving down there, Petrova. My guys were doing drill patterns on level 10. It was quiet. The buildup was a descent from data into unease. Anya began a private audit, reviewing old seismic records. She found the same anomalous signature recurring at random intervals, always between a M and a M, never lasting more than an hour, and always on a different, inactive mining level. It appeared 7 times over the past 2 years, each time dismissed as ground settling or sensor ghosting in the official logs. She noticed a pattern the logs had missed. Each phantom event occurred on the anniversary of a significant incident. The first corresponded to the date a slope failure buried a haul truck in 1985. Another matched the anniversary of a fatal accident involving a crane operator in 1998. Her investigation moved from the digital to the physical. During her daylight inspections, she began paying closer attention to the abandoned levels. On level 8, a section closed for 5 years, she found something that defied her engineering logic. Fresh scrape marks on a high wall. Not the smooth, curved gouges of a bucket, but deep, parallel striations, as if made by something with 3 or 4 massive, dragging claws. The rock around the marks was warm to the touch, and the air smelled sharply of sulfur and hot metal, a smell that vanished 10 feet in either direction. She took a photograph and a thermal reading. The image showed the marks clearly. The thermal gun showed a residual heat signature of 101 degrees Fahrenheit in the rock, while the surrounding face was 68 degrees. The reveal came on the anniversary of the mine's very first fatality, a cave-in from 1923. Anya, unable to ignore the data, stayed late, telling security she was running calibration tests. At 2:45 a.m., seated alone in the trailer, she watched the seismic monitors come alive. The rhythmic pulse began, stronger than ever, originating from level 5, a flooded section now used as a drainage sump. The security feed for level 5 was dark. The camera listed as offline water damage, but a camera on level 6, pointing upwards, captured something else. Not the machine, but its effect. The lights on level 5, all 20 of them, began to dim and brighten in perfect, heavy sync with the seismic pulses, as if drawing immense, fluctuating power. Then, on the audio feed from level 6, she heard it. Not the roar of a diesel engine, but a deep, subterranean grinding, like continental plates shearing, and beneath it, a low, resonant hum that made the coffee in her mug vibrate in concentric circles. She called the security rover to check level 6. The guard, a man named Luis, radioed back, his voice tight. "I'm here. There's nothing on level 6. But you need to hear this." He held his radio microphone toward the access tunnel to level 5. Over the air, clear as day, Anya heard the sounds of industrial activity, the crash of rock, the shriek of metal on stone, the distinct two-tone warning beep of a vehicle reversing, and voices, muffled shouts, as if from a crew. Luis came back on, whispering now. "That's impossible. Level 5 is under 30 feet of water. There haven't been men down there in 15 years. The aftermath is documented in Enya's official report to Western Atlas and her subsequent resignation letter, which we have obtained." The company's investigation, led by an internal safety officer, concluded she had experienced auditory and visual pareidolia due to fatigue and the stressful, isolated environment. The seismic activity was attributed to subaquatic tectonic shifts and the scrape marks to natural weathering. Her photo and thermal data were deemed inconclusive. The verification comes from two independent sources. First, a retired mine superintendent, who agreed to speak only anonymously, confirmed that anniversary phenomena were an open secret among old-timers at Crimson Ledge. He referred to it as the echo shift, a time when the mine replayed its memories. Second, and more chilling, are the pre-digital dispatch ledgers from the 1970s. In a logbook for March 12, 1978, a night foreman wrote an entry that was later circled in red pen by someone else. It reads, "Called to level 4 on reports of a shovel operating without authorization. Found no equipment. Ground was vibrating. Heard men yelling in the distance, calling a warning in Spanish. No Spanish-speaking crews on shift. Checked roster. Sounds match description of the 55 mudslide victims' crew. Reported to management. Told to forget it." Anya Petrova left mining altogether and now works for a civil engineering firm in Phoenix. She has never spoken publicly about her experience. In a private correspondence with a fellow researcher, however, she wrote this final, troubling line: "The data was not wrong. The mine is not haunted by ghosts. It is haunted by the work itself. The explosions, the digging, the deaths, they are recorded in the stone. And on certain nights, under the right pressure, the stone presses play." Today, the Crimson Ledge mine still operates. New engineers are told the story of Anya's glitch as a cautionary tale about overwork. But veteran geologists, reviewing the full, unedited seismic archive, note a curious, unclassifiable signal pattern that continues to appear sporadically on the anniversaries of past tragedies. It is always logged, and always filed under miscellaneous non-threatening. The mine, it seems, has not finished replaying all of its memories. The Gallery of Hands. Leo Brandt was a surveyor for the Meridian Geological Service, a contractor hired to map the extensive, labyrinthine network of the Silver Queen played-out silver mine in Colorado. His job was not to find ore, but to create precise digital models of the old workings for safety and potential remediation. He was a precise man in his late 50s, whose universe was one of laser points, gyroscopic compasses, and three-dimensional renderings. He took pride in converting the chaotic, dangerous dark into an orderly map of lines and data points. The Silver Queen, closed since the 1970s, was a tomb of silent tunnels, its timber supports groaning with age, its air stale and motionless. Leo's team consisted of himself and a young assistant, Kyle, who handled the drone for larger cavities. The inciting incident was a discrepancy in the map. Leo was scanning a section known as the West Fork Gallery, a wide, high-ceiling tunnel where silver had been particularly rich. His laser scanner painted the space in millions of points of light. Back in the surface office trailer, as the software compiled the data, an anomaly appeared. According to the scan, the northern wall of the gallery, which should have been solid rock according to the century-old hand-drawn mine plans, showed a recess. A narrow, vertical fissure, roughly 7 feet tall and 2 feet wide, leading into an uncharted space. The old maps showed nothing. It could have been a later collapse, or an exploratory drift the original miners never recorded. To Leo, it was a puzzle to be solved, a blank spot to be filled. He and Kyle returned the next day to investigate physically. They found the fissure exactly where the scan indicated. The rock around the opening was strange smooth, almost polished, unlike the rough blasted surface of the main gallery. And it was cold. A deep, damp cold that seeped through their coveralls, distinct from the consistent, cool temperature of the mine. Leo, against standard protocol for uncharted areas, decided to enter. The passage was a tight squeeze, winding for about 30 feet before it opened into a small oval chamber no larger than a walk-in closet. His headlamp revealed the walls. They were covered, floor to ceiling, in handprints. They were not painted or stained. They were impressions, as if someone with intensely hot hands had pressed into the stone itself, melting the rock slightly. The impressions were of all sizes: large, work-worn adult hands, smaller, delicate ones, even the tiny outlines of children's fingers. They overlapped in a chaotic, desperate mosaic. The rock within the impressions was a different color, a lusterless, dark gray, compared to the surrounding brown ore. Kyle, whispering, said it looked like volcanic glass. Leo, against his better judgment, reached out and placed his own hand over one of the prints. It was a perfect match for his size, and the stone was warm. The buildup was a cascade of equipment failure and psychological distress. The digital files from that day's scan corrupted entirely. The backup drives failed. The only record of the chamber was Leo's handwritten field notes and a single, blurry photo Kyle took before his camera died. That night, both men dreamed the same dream, a sensation of being trapped in total, airless darkness, with only the feeling of warm stone against their palms. Kyle called in sick the next day and never returned to the site. Leo, stubborn and scientific, went back alone. He took rock core samples from the chamber wall, careful not to damage the handprints. He noted the GPS coordinates, though the signal was patchy at that depth. But the mine seemed to rebel against his intrusion. His brand new lithium batteries drained in minutes. His radio emitted only a low, buzzing hum in the chamber. And the handprints, they had changed. He was certain of it. The pattern was different. The small, child-sized print that had been near the floor was now higher up, beside a large, splayed adult hand, as if reaching. The warmth in the room had increased. It was now a stifling, dry heat that left his mouth parched. His own hand, the one he'd matched to the print, began to ache with a deep, bone-deep throb, as if he had been leaning on it for hours. The reveal came from the core sample analysis, sent to a metallurgy lab Leo had used for years. The results were baffling. The rock was not native to the Silver Queen seam. Its mineral composition was closer to that of a rare type of metamorphic rock found only in deep tectonic subduction zones, miles deeper than any human mind had ever reached. But the truly unsettling detail was in the spectrography. Trapped within the glassy rock were microscopic, carbonized structures. The lab's report, in cautious, clinical language, stated they bore a morphological resemblance: epidermal cells, specifically human stratum corneum. They were finding fossilized, or more accurately, thermally fused, human skin cells within the stone itself. Armed with this impossibility, Leo went to the historical archives in the nearest county records office. He combed through accident reports for the Silver Queen. The official tally was 44 deaths over its 80-year operation. But in a box of unsorted, pre-1900 payroll ledgers, he found a brittle, yellowed sheet of paper. It was a handwritten list, not an official document, titled Missing Unaccounted. It contained 17 names, with dates spanning from 1892 to 1910. The notes beside them were cryptic: went to relieve himself, never returned, lost in a fall, body not recovered, chased a canary into a drift, sealed after collapse. The final note, at the bottom of the page, read, "The mountain takes its tide. Do not follow the warm walls." Leo understood then. The chamber was not a place where people had left marks. It was a place where the mountain had taken them, absorbing them into itself, leaving only the screaming signature of their final, pushing touch on the stone. The warmth was the residual energy of that absorption. The changing prints were not a trick of the light. They were the mountain slowly, over decades, digesting. The aftermath is split between the corporate record and Leo's personal collapse. Meridian Geological terminated the Silver Queen contract, citing budgetary concerns. Their final report to the mining authority makes no mention of the chamber, only of unstable and anomalous geology in the West Fork area, which they recommended for permanent sealing. Leo was let go shortly after, with a generous severance package and a strict non-disclosure agreement. The verification exists in the archived correspondence of the original Silver Queen Company. A letter from the site manager to the owners in 1905, pleading for funds to brick up several old tunnels, states, "The men are superstitious. They speak of the warm room and say it calls to them. 3 good workers have vanished this quarter alone, all last seen near the West Fork. We must close it off, or we shall lose more than silver." Leo Brandt sold his surveying equipment and moved to a coastal town, as far from mountains as he could get. He took up painting, but his subjects are always the same. Thousands of overlapping hands, in shades of gray and black, covering every inch of the canvas. In a rare moment of candor with a former colleague, he said, "I mapped it. I know its dimensions. It's 12 by 8 by 9 feet. A pocket, a stomach. And it's not full. My handprint is up there now. I can feel it. When the mountain gets hungry again, it knows exactly where I am." The West Fork Gallery of the Silver Queen Mine is now sealed behind a welded steel gate, marked with danger signs. Cavers who have ventured to the gate report a constant, gentle warmth radiating from the metal, and a faint, dusty smell like old plaster and salt. And on rare, utterly silent days, if you place your ear to the rock, you don't hear a thing, but you can feel a subtle, rhythmic vibration, a slow, contented pulse. The Deep Drill Project, Orpheus. Dr. Arise Thorne was a project manager for the Geodynamic Research Initiative, a quasi-governmental consortium exploring advanced geothermal energy. His background was in physics, not folklore. The project, codenamed Orpheus, was an engineering marvel, a super-deep borehole drilled into the Precambrian bedrock of the Finnish crust, aiming to tap into the Earth's immense inner heat. The site was a stark, white installation in the frozen wilderness, a temple of technology. Arise oversaw a crew of 30 scientists and engineers, monitoring the drill string as it penetrated deeper than any human-made hole had gone before, surpassing even the old Kola Superdeep. Their world was one of telemetry, core samples, and seismic feedback loops. The only darkness here was on computer screens, rendered in clean data. The inciting incident was a sound, but one that came through the instruments, not the air. At a depth of 14,792 meters, the drill's acoustic monitoring array began picking up a signal. It was a low-frequency resonance, just at the edge of human hearing, that the computers translated into an audible waveform. Initially, the team thought it was a harmonic vibration from the drill bit itself, a product of friction and incredible pressure. But when they briefly halted drilling, the sound did not stop. It continued, a deep, cello-like drone, pulsing in a slow, regular pattern. The pattern, one of the younger seismologists noted with unease, matched the rhythm of a human heartbeat at rest, approximately 58 beats per minute. They named it the hum. Core samples from that depth showed something unprecedented, veins of a previously unknown crystalline material that fluoresced under UV light. The lab report called it a high-pressure silicate polymorph. The drill foreman called it hell glass. The buildup was a systematic unraveling of environmental control. The hum became a constant presence in the headsets of the monitoring team. It was inescapable. Personnel began reporting headaches, nosebleeds, and a persistent metallic taste. More disturbingly, the borehole itself began to exhibit anomalous behavior. Temperature readings would spike hundreds of degrees in a localized zone, then plummet, defying all geothermal models. The pressure sensors indicated violent fluctuations, as if something in the hole was breathing. Then came the video feed. A fiber optic camera lower down the borehole revealed the smooth, glassy walls of the deep shaft. At the 15-kilometer mark, the camera showed something that made the control room fall silent. The wall of the borehole, for a stretch of about 2 meters, was moving. It was a slow, peristaltic contraction and expansion, as if the rock itself was muscular, organic. The fluorescing veins pulsed in time with the hum. Eerie, a rationalist, ordered every conceivable diagnostic. He brought in consultants from neurology and audiology to assess the crew's symptoms. The medical reports concluded mass psychogenic illness triggered by infrasound exposure. The geologists proposed a radical new model of ductile rock deformation under ultra-high pressure, but Eerie kept a private log. He noted that the drill bit's rate of penetration would inexplicably slow, then speed up, as if it were biting into something soft, then hitting a void. The core samples began to change. Mixed with the strange fluorescent crystal were inclusions of a black, fibrous material. Biological analysis returned contaminated, but one technician swore the fibers, under a microscope, resembled mineralized nerve tissue. The reveal was not a single moment, but a cascade of data that formed an unbearable picture. The seismic arrays placed around the borehole to monitor microearthquakes started picking up signals that moved. Not the random pattern of tectonic shifts, but deliberate, rhythmic vibrations that traveled up the borehole shaft from depths below the drill head, then circled the installation at a depth of about 5 kilometers before descending again. The pattern, when visualized, looked like a lasso or a noose. The final piece came from the linguistic analysis software, a tool used to find patterns in chaotic data. A programmer, on a whim, fed the audio waveform of the hum into the system, asking it to find matches in its vast database of sound profiles. The program returned one match with a 91% correlation, not to geological or mechanical sounds, to a biological recording from a classified marine biology study, the vocalization of a colossal squid, a creature of the absolute deep, slowed down by a factor of 10,000. The hum was not a sound of geology, it was a voice, and they had drilled into its domain. The aftermath is contained in the heavily redacted final report of the Geodynamic Research Initiative. Project Orpheus was terminated due to unforeseen geological hazards and cost overruns. The borehole was sealed with a 500-ton cement plug, capped with steel. All personnel were reassigned under strict confidentiality agreements. The official story is one of a failed but valuable scientific experiment. The verification comes from 2 leaks. The first is a series of encrypted emails between senior staff, later decrypted by a journalist. One reads, "The consensus is we did not drill into hell. We drilled into something asleep, and we woke it up. The vibrations are not reactions. They are questions." The second is the testimony of a Finnish security guard who patrolled the perimeter after the site was abandoned. He submitted a sworn statement to local police, later filed as a curiosity report. He claimed that on still winter nights, he could feel the ground vibrate through the soles of his boots, and the northern lights, which typically danced in silent green waves, would directly above the sealed borehole coalesce into a tight, swirling spiral of deep red and violet, pulsing in perfect time with the vibrations underfoot. The phenomenon was photographed by Aurora hunters and dismissed as a rare atmospheric effect. Dr. Eerie Thorne resigned from geophysics and now teaches high school science in Helsinki. He is known for his intense, fearful lectures on the limits of human knowledge. He never speaks of Project Orpheus, but his former deputy told an investigator, under promise of anonymity, that in the last days of the project, Rees had stared at the seismic monitor showing the circling, lasso-like vibrations, and had murmured a line from the myth that gave the project its name. He looked back. That was the one condition, and he broke it. We didn't just look back. We knocked on the door. The Orpheus borehole site is now a fenced-off, barren plot monitored by satellite. Geological surveys of the region show a persistent, shallow seismic anomaly centered on the plug, a slow, rhythmic tremor that registers a consistent 0.5 on the Richter scale. It has never varied, never stopped. It is logged by the Finnish Geological Survey as a non-tectonic, harmonic microseism of unknown origin, a heartbeat, 58 beats per minute, echoing up from a darkness 15 kilometers deep, waiting for an answer. The Canary Keeper of Hawthorne Pit. Eleanor Vance was not a miner. She was the chief archivist and records keeper for the now-defunct Hawthorne Anthracite Company in Pennsylvania. Her domain was a dusty, oak-paneled office above ground, filled with ledgers, brittle maps, and personnel files dating back to 1881. She was a woman in her 60s, precise and unsentimental, who believed the truth of a place was in its paper trail. The Hawthorne Pit had closed in 1991 after a fatal methane explosion, sealed with a concrete cap. Eleanor's job was to preserve its history before the company dissolved. Her only connection to the depths was through ink and faded photographs. She took pride in cataloging every accident, every promotion, every Canary's serial number used for gas detection. The inciting incident was a box misplaced for decades, labeled "Sundry Effects Unclaimed." It was found during a final warehouse clearance. Inside were the personal items of miners who had died on the job, never retrieved by family. There were pocket watches, wedding rings, a harmonica. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather-bound notebook. It was a canary keeper's log. Canary keepers were specialized workers responsible for the small birds carried into the mines to detect carbon monoxide. The notebook detailed dates, canary numbers, and brief notes on their behavior. The keeper's name was Silas Grier. The final entry, dated November 7th, 1991, the day of the explosion, was different. The handwriting, previously neat, was a frantic scrawl. It read, "Bird number 43 not singing, not sick, listening. It hears them talking in the gob. Told Foreman Carter." He laughed. "I'm not taking number 43 down tomorrow. It knows. It's trying to tell us." The entry ended there. Silas Grier had died in the explosion. Eleanor, methodical as ever, cross-referenced the log. Canary number 43 was not listed in the official inventory of assets lost in the disaster. Furthermore, Silas Grier's personnel file contained a disciplinary notice from the week before his death. The reason? Refusal to deploy assigned gas detection animal. Claimed animal was compromised. This minor inconsistency nagged at her. Why would a veteran keeper, or a man whose job relied on the birds, refuse to take one down? The buildup began when Eleanor decided to organize the mine's vast collection of safety inspection tapes. These were audio recordings made by foremen during their pre-shift checks, dictating conditions into a handheld recorder. She started digitizing them. The tape from November 6, 1991, the day before the explosion, was marked Routine Section D. As Eleanor listened with her studio headphones, she heard Foreman Carter's bored voice listing timber grades and air readings. But in the background, underneath his speech, was another sound. It was faint, almost like interference. She isolated the audio track and applied filters, removing Carter's voice. What remained was a chilling, rhythmic sound. Not the chirp of a canary, but a low, chittering warble. And beneath that, something else. A whispery, rasping murmur, impossible to make out his words, but undeniably patterned, like distant, overlapping conversations. The timestamp placed this audio from a section of the mine called the Gob, an area of collapsed workings behind a retaining wall. According to the map, it was a dead zone, void of life and air. Her investigation turned to the seismic data from that period, stored on old mainframe tapes. She enlisted a retired geologist to help translate the raw numbers. They found a pattern that had been overlooked in the official inquiry. For the 6 months leading to the explosion, there were consistent, ultra-low frequency vibrations emanating from the Gob area. They were not earthquake tremors. They formed a complex, repeating sequence, like a code or a cadence. The geologist, pale, said it resembled the waveform of speech. Extremely slow, deep, resonant speech. The pressure waves were not traveling through the rock. They were being conducted by the massive coal seam itself, as if the deposit was acting as a whispering gallery for something on the other side of the collapses. The reveal came from two sources Eleanor pieced together. First, she found Silas Grier's last will and testament in a county probate file. He left his entire estate, a modest sum, to a local avian sanctuary. The attached letter to the sanctuary director read, "The birds have always been the first to know. We used them to sniff the poison air, but they hear the poison thoughts in the stone. Number 43 is the last true listener. Keep her safe. She heard the old ones waking up, and she told me. Now, they know we can hear them." The letter was dated the day before his death. Second, and definitively, was the testimony of the only survivor from the immediate area of the initial blast, a miner named Joe Henderson, who had been in a coma for months and whose interview was dismissed as trauma-induced delirium. His statement, buried in a hospital report, was direct. "It wasn't gas. I was checking a pump near the gob wall. I heard it first, like rocks grinding teeth. Then I heard the canaries. All of them, from every crew in the section. They all went silent at once. Not dead, just listening. Then the wall, it breathed. It swelled out, then sucked in. And then it spoke. It wasn't a word. It was a name. It said, Silas. Then the world turned to fire." The official report attributed Henderson's account to hallucination from oxygen deprivation prior to the blast. The aftermath saw the Hawthorne pit sealed forever. Eleanor completed her archival project, delivering a comprehensive history to the State Mining Museum. The official history makes no mention of Canary number 43, Silas Grier's notebook, or the anomalous audio. The disaster remains attributed to a buildup of methane ignited by a faulty electrical junction box, a conclusion supported by physical evidence. But the verification persists in the living world. Eleanor, upon retirement, adopted a rescued canary from the sanctuary Grier had named in his will. The bird, she was told, was a descendant of a line bred specifically for the Hawthorne mine. The bird never sings like the others. It sits for hours, utterly still, head cocked, listening to the interior walls of Eleanor's home. Sometimes, it will let out a single, sharp chirp at a closed closet door or a blank patch of floorboard. When Eleanor plays the filtered audio from the safety tape, the chittering warble and the rasping whispers, the bird becomes agitated, fluttering wildly, trying to burrow into the corner of its cage. And in the town near the sealed mine, residents who live in the old company houses report a strange phenomenon. On certain quiet nights, they can hear, through the heating vents or the water pipes, a faint, rhythmic vibration. It's not enough to shake anything, just enough to feel. And every dog in the neighborhood, without fail, will begin to whine simultaneously, pressing their noses to the floor, as if listening to a call from deep, deep below. The local vet has no explanation, noting only that it happens with unsettling regularity, like a tide no one can see. The perfect coal of the Yuba Drift. Marcus Lee was a procurement agent for a high-end boutique forge in California that catered to master bladesmiths and artists. He sourced rare metals and unique fuels. His job was one of connoisseurship, of discerning subtle qualities invisible to the untrained eye. In the fall of 2018, he was contacted by a reclusive seller from Kentucky who offered a small quantity of antique seam coal, allegedly from a family-held plot from a played-out mine called the Yuba Drift. The sample that arrived was unlike any coal Marcus had seen. It was jet black, with a vitreous luster, and fractured into perfectly geometric, hexagonal prisms. It was incredibly dense for its size and cold to the touch, even in the warm office. When burned in a test furnace, it produced a heat so intense and so clean, left almost no ash, only a fine, white powder. It also produced a flame that burned in absolute silence, with no crackle or pop. The bladesmiths who used it reported forging steels of unparalleled strength and sharpness, with a distinctive, water-like pattern in the metal. Marcus had to have more. The inciting incident was his journey to the source. The seller, an elderly man named Harlan Marsh, insisted on meeting at the mine entrance itself, boarded up a dit on his heavily wooded, failing property. The mine had been closed by a cave-in 1952, killing Harlan's grandfather and for others. Harlan was a bitter, nervous man, who spoke of the coal with a mixture of pride and dread. He led Marcus to a small, illegal shed he'd built over a ventilation borehole he'd unsealed. Using a winch and bucket, He would extract a few pounds of the perfect coal every month from a narrow side seam that had been exposed by the collapse. "It's the only thing keeping this land," Harlan muttered. "But it don't like being took." "You'll see," Marcus, focused on the commodity, dismissed this as backwoods superstition. He secured an exclusive contract, paying Harlan a significant sum for regular shipments. The buildup began with the effects of the coal itself, not on the metal, but on the environment and the people around it. The white ash residue, when analyzed, was primarily calcium phosphate with traces of crystalline silica. A consulting geologist was baffled. It was a chemical composition more akin to bone ash and high-grade quartz than coal clinker. Workers at the forge began complaining of vivid, shared dreams on nights when the Yuba coal was used. They all dreamed of standing in a vast, dark, hexagonal chamber, feeling a profound, intelligent pressure, and hearing a sound like a giant crystal humming. One smith quit, saying the silent flame watched him. Then, the shipments became irregular. Harlan's letters, once terse but legible, became rambling and paranoid. He wrote of shapes moving in the borehole that weren't reflections, of tools left near the hole being found bent into precise, angular shapes overnight, and of a cold spot that had begun to emanate from the hole, killing all plant life in a 10-foot radius. He claimed the seam was fighting back. Marcus, now financially and professionally invested, traveled back to Kentucky. He found Harlan a changed man, gaunt, jumpy, living in his truck far from the shed. The shed itself was covered in a thick layer of frost, despite it being a mild autumn day. Marcus, armed with the high-resolution borescope camera, decided to investigate the borehole himself. Against Harlan's frantic protests, he lowered the camera down the 80-foot shaft. The monitor showed the rough rock of the original ventilation shaft, then the opening into the side seam Harlan had been mining. The camera panned. The seam was not a typical coal bed. The walls were composed entirely of the perfect geometric coal, forming a honeycomb of hexagonal tunnels that receded into impossible darkness. And then, in the camera's powerful light, he saw it. Embedded in the coal face, like insects in amber, were shapes. The outline of a hand, pressing outward. The profile of a face, mouth open in a silent scream. They were not fossils. They were impressions, as if living people had been instantly encapsulated in the forming mineral. One of them, he could swear, wore the rounded cap of a 1950 seconds miner. The camera's temperature sensor showed the area was -20 degrees Celsius. The reveal was a brutal lesson in predatory geology. Marcus, shaken, took his findings to the State Geological Survey, accessing their archives under the guise of academic research. The file on the Yuba Drift cave-in was thin. The official cause was pillar collapse, a common mining accident. But a handwritten note from a first responder, attached to a faded photograph, told a different story. The photograph showed the cave-in site. The rock that had collapsed was not rubble. It was a smooth, geometric wall of black, hexagonal columns that had sheared through timber supports like they were balsa wood. The note read, "Found the crew, or part of them, there in the wall. Jonesy is looking right at me, but he's made of black glass. We're sealing it. Don't tell the families." Marcus finally understood. The Yuba Drift hadn't hit a coal seam. It had intruded upon something else, a crystalline, possibly crystalline organism, or a geological formation with properties of both mineral and life. It had defended itself. It absorbed the miners, transforming them into part of its structure, and it began producing the perfect coal as a lure, a bait to draw in more life, more warmth, more consciousness to consume and transmute. Harlan's small-scale theft had been tolerated, perhaps even encouraged, as a way to spread its influence through the objects forged in its heat. The aftermath is one of quiet, corporate containment. Marcus terminated his contract with Harlan, citing unreliable supply. He destroyed his remaining stock of Yuba coal, pulverizing it and dissolving it in acid. He never told his clients the source of their superior steel. Harlan Marsh was found dead of hypothermia in his truck 6 months later, less than 100 yards from the frosted shed. The coroner noted the interior of the truck was at ambient temperature, yet Harlan's core body temperature was that of someone who had died in a blizzard. The verification exists in two forms. First, A sample of the white ash from the forge was obtained by a materials scientist who published a paper on its anomalous structure, noting its quasi-crystalline arrangement defying standard thermodynamic models of combustion. The paper is a footnote in obscure journals. Second, and more chilling, the blades. The weapons and tools forged with yuba coal still exist. Their owners report an uncanny sharpness that never seems to dull. But they also report oddities. The blades never feel warm to the touch, always slightly cool. They sometimes, in very quiet rooms, emit a faint, high-frequency hum, like a tuning fork, and those who carry them for long periods begin to have the dreams. The dream of the hexagonal chamber, the pressure, and the hum. It is a slow, patient broadcast from a scene that is not coal, calling its creations, and their owners, home. The Echo pilots of the sunken diamond mine. Captain Elias Vance commanded the Abyssal Surveyor, a deep-sea remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, used for industrial inspection and recovery. His workplace was a control van on the deck of a support ship, his view of the world through high-definition monitors and sonar screens. He was ex-Navy, pragmatic, and trusted his instruments more than his gut. The client was a Canadian mining consortium performing a feasibility study on the Polaris V, a diamond-bearing kimberlite pipe off the coast of Namibia that had been flooded and abandoned in the 1970s after a catastrophic breach. The goal was to map the submerged tunnels and assess the possibility of sealing them for future pumping. To Vance, it was a job, a complex one, given the depth over 1,200 meters and the labyrinthine nature of the old mine, but just another dive. The inciting incident was a sonar ghost. On the third dive, as the ROV navigated down a main access tunnel called the shaft, the forward-looking sonar began painting a return that shouldn't have existed. 20 meters ahead, in a section the historical maps showed as a solid rock wall, the sonar indicated an open vertical shaft descending at least another 100 meters. The maps were wrong. It happened. But when Vance directed the ROV's powerful lights towards the opening, the video feed showed only a smooth, featureless wall of dark rock. The sonar insisted there was a hole. The cameras saw solid stone. Puzzled, he switched to the ROV's laser scanning system to build a 3D map. The laser data confirmed the sonar perfect, circular shaft, 3 meters in diameter. Yet the cameras, from every angle, showed unbroken wall. It was a blind spot in reality, visible only to machines. They logged it as a sensor discordance and continued the survey, but a cold knot of unease settled in Vance's stomach. The buildup was a parade of technological hauntings. The ROV's manipulator arm, a titanium claw tool used for taking samples, began to move erratically when near the anomalous areas. Diagnostics showed no faults. On one pass, the arm independently reached out and gently, almost tenderly, brushed the rock wall where the phantom shaft was supposed to be. The strain gauge on the arm registered resistance, as if it were touching something solid, but the cameras showed the claw moving through empty water. Then came the audio. The ROV carried sensitive hydrophones. In the control van, the audio feed began to pick up sounds, not the usual creaks of pressure on the hull or the whir of its own thrusters, but distinct, mechanical rhythms. The repetitive clunk 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 of a pneumatic drill, the screech of metal on stone, and voices, muffled, distorted by water and time, but unmistakably human voices shouting instructions, warnings, calls for ore carts. The sounds were always just ahead, around the next corner, in a section of the mine that had been empty and flooded for 50 years. The most disturbing event occurred when the ROV entered a large, excavated chamber marked on the old plans as the cathedral. The vehicle's lights barely pierced the gloom, illuminating towering pillars of rock left to support the ceiling. The hydrophones exploded with noise, a chaotic cacophony of machinery and panicked yells. On the video feed, the silt-laden water seemed to thicken, to coalesce. The sonar clouded with thousands of fleeting returns, human-sized and moving. And then, for 3 seconds, the cameras saw them, translucent, shimmer outlines in the water, like heat haze, but shaped like men in outdated diving gear, the bulky, copper-helmeted suits of 1972nd commercial divers. They were moving in a slow, choreographed panic around a borehole at the chamber's center, their gestures frantic. Then the image flickered, and they were gone. The ROV's internal clock jumped ahead by 14 minutes. All sensor logs for that period were a garbled mess of static. The reveal came from a source Vance had initially ignored: the personal effects of the lost crew. In the ship's archive, he found a watertight locker containing letters and photos recovered from the shore after the disaster. One was a letter from a diver named Hendrik van der Merwe to his wife, dated 2 days before the breach. The final paragraph read, "The boys are talking nonsense about the deep cuts. They say the rock is singing to them, that it shows them holes that aren't there. The foreman says it's pressure sickness, but Jansen swears he saw a man in an old-timey suit waving at him from a sealed tunnel. This place is wrong, my love. It remembers every pick strike, every dynamite blast, and I think it's starting to replay them with us in the cast." Vance, now deeply alarmed, ordered the ROV to the coordinates of the original breach, where the sea had catastrophically flooded the mine. The scar in the earth was a jagged tear. As the ROV hovered at its edge, the hydrophones captured a new sound beneath the ghostly machinery: a deep, wet, rhythmic inhalation and exhalation, as if the mine itself was breathing through the rupture. Then, the ROV's external comm system, designed only to receive commands from the ship, crackled. A voice, clear and desperate, came through on the ROV's operational frequency only the control vent should have been using. It was a man's voice, speaking Afrikaans, choking with panic. "Die water is nie water nie. Dit dink. Dit onthu." The translation from the ship's interpreter was instant. "The water is not water. It thinks. It remembers." The transmission ended with a burst of static that, when slowed down, contained the distinct, overlapping screams of at least 6 different men. The aftermath saw the survey terminated immediately. The client cited unforeseen technical challenges and hazardous conditions. The official report blamed complex magnetic fields from the kimberlite pipe for the sensor anomalies and acoustic reverberations in flooded tunnels for the audio phenomena. Captain Vance's dive logs, however, tell a different story. His final entry states, "We did not map a mine. We mapped a memory, a traumatic, recursive memory held in the water and the magnetized rock. The men who died there are not gone. They are trapped in the moment of the breach, forever drowning, and their panic has seeped into the geology. The verification is found in the records of other deep-sea mining ventures." A declassified report from a 1992 Soviet effort to reclaim a flooded tin mine in the Bering Sea mentions persistent psychoacoustic phenomena and sonar phantoms leading to the project's abandonment. Furthermore, maritime databases show an unusual number of equipment malfunctions and personnel incidents on ships stationed over the Polaris V site for unrelated reasons, from seismic surveys to cable-laying operations. Crews report nightmares of drowning in the dark and hearing drilling sounds through the hull. Captain Vance took a shore-based job teaching ROV piloting. He is known for a peculiar, non-standard lesson. He has students pilot their simulators through a meticulously recreated model of the Polaris shaft. At a specific coordinate, he introduces a sensor glitch. The sonar shows an obstacle the cameras cannot see. Over 70% of students, unaware of the backstory, instinctively steer the virtual ROV to avoid the non-existent obstacle. When asked why, they shrug and say, "It felt like there was something there." Vance just nods. The memory, he believes, is not just in the mind, it's in the act of piloting itself, a ghost in the machine, waiting for the next vehicle to descend and join the endless, replaying panic of the final shift. The subterranean tide of the salt caverns. Lena Flores was a hydrogeologist for the New Mexico Environmental Protection Division. Her specialty was mapping and protecting aquifers. When the small town of Halcyon Wells reported that their primary well, which tapped into a deep ancient saline aquifer, had begun producing water that was not only saltier than ever, but also exhibited bizarre gelatinous clumps and emitted a faint phosphorescent glow. Lena was dispatched. She was a skeptic, attributing most weird water stories to bacterial blooms or industrial contamination. Halcyon Well sat above a network of massive, natural salt caverns, some of which had been used for storage decades prior. Lena expected to find a leaking hazardous waste tank or a bizarre extremophile colony. She arrived with her testing kits, her sampling bottles, and her unwavering trust in chemistry. The inciting incident was her first downwell camera survey. The town's well was over 800 feet deep, piercing through the salt layer into a water-filled cavity. The camera descended into darkness, its lights revealing the smooth, dissolved walls of the salt dome. At around 750 feet, the water clarity changed. It became hazy, filled with drifting, translucent particles that glowed a sickly green in the camera's light. And then she saw the current. The water in this deep cavern was not still. It was flowing in a slow, powerful, and perfectly circular current, like a massive underwater whirlpool. This defied all hydrogeological models for a confined, pressurized aquifer. As the camera rotated with the flow, its light swept across the cavern wall. There, etched into the salt itself, were patterns. Not tool marks or natural fractures, but intricate, swirling glyphs and spirals that covered vast sections. They looked like a madman's attempt to map celestial orbits, or the nervous system of some colossal creature. The town's mayor, watching over her shoulder, whispered. The old miners talked about the writing on the walls. They said it wasn't there one day, and it was the next. The buildup was physical and psychological. Lena's water samples were a scientific nightmare. The gelatinous material, when analyzed, was a biocomposite of halophilic bacteria, crystalline salts, and long-chain proteins that had no business existing in a sterile, high-salinity environment. It was, a baffled biologist colleague told her, structured, not grown. Like scaffolding, the water itself exhibited temporary, non-Newtonian properties when agitated. It would thicken momentarily before returning to liquid. Then, the town's animals began to behave erratically. Dogs refused to go outside at night, howling at the ground. Birds abandoned nests built near the wellhead. Several townspeople, including the mayor, reported the same dream, a sensation of floating in a warm, dark sea, surrounded by the glowing glyphs, and hearing a deep, harmonic drone that felt like it was vibrating their bones. Lena expanded her investigation to the abandoned salt mine whose tunnels crisscrossed the upper layers of the dome. She discovered that the mining company had ceased operations not due to depleted salt, but after a series of acoustic events. Logs from 1972 described miners hearing great inhalation from the lower, unmined depths, followed by tremors that caused no damage, but left the men with debilitating vertigo and nosebleeds for days. One entry noted, "The salt is singing, and it's pulling the water in time with the tune." Determined to find the source, Lena used ground-penetrating radar to map the lower caverns. The images revealed the hydrogeological impossibility. The aquifer was not a static lake. It was a series of interconnected chambers, and the water was moving between them in a slow, coordinated pulse, with the central cavity, the one under the town, while acting as a heart. The pulse rate was one complete cycle every 36 hours. She set up seismic monitors. They picked up the pulse as a soft, deep tremor. And they picked up something else, a secondary, fainter vibration that was a perfect mirror of the pulse, but out of phase, as if something was responding from even deeper below. The reveal came the night she stayed late at the wellhead monitoring station, tracking the peak of the 36-hour pulse. The flow meter on the well showed the water level inside the casing was not just rising. It was oscillating rhythmically, in time with the seismic tremor. She played the hydrophone down the well. The harmonic drone from the townspeople's dreams filled the trailer, a beautiful and terrifying chord that seemed to resonate in her teeth. Then, over the drone, she heard clicks. Precise, complex sequences of clicks. She ran them through a sonographic analyzer. The pattern was not random. It had the syntactical markers of a language, with repeating units and modifiers. The aquifer wasn't just singing, it was speaking. The final piece was in a forgotten report from the U.S. Geological Survey Archives, a single paragraph buried in a study on Precambrian geology. It hypothesized that certain ultra-deep, hypersaline aquifers, isolated for hundreds of millions of years, could develop into chemical ecosystems of such complexity that non-carbon-based, fluidic sentience is not merely possible, but probable. The report called them brine mines. The town of Halcyon Wells hadn't contaminated their aquifer. They had drilled a borehole into the sensory organ of a thinking, planet-scale entity composed of salt, water, and pressure. The glyphs on the walls were not writing. They were scars from its thoughts, crystallization patterns formed by focused shifts in salinity and current. The town was drawing its water from the entity's circulatory system. The aftermath was a bureaucratic cover-up masked as a public health victory. Lena filed an emergency recommendation to permanently cap the well and relocate the town's water source. The state, fearing panic and liability, agreed. The official statement cited naturally occurring toxic minerals and radiological elements in the water. The well was plugged with concrete. The townspeople were given a bland, reassuring explanation, and a new, shallow well was drilled 5 miles away. The verification is ongoing and subtle. Lena continues to monitor the seismic data from a station she secretly maintains. The 36-hour pulse continues, unwavering, but the response pulse, the echo, has changed. It has begun to slowly, incrementally, synchronize with the primary pulse. The two rhythms are moving into harmony. Furthermore, core samples from other deep saline aquifers around the world, when examined with Lena's research in mind, show similar, faint crystallization patterns in their salt layers. A scientific paper she co-authored on hydrochemical resonance patterns was quietly published in a niche journal, ignored by the mainstream. Lena Flores still works for the EPA. She is now hyper-vigilant about any water sample that shows unusual viscosity or luminescence. In a private memo to a trusted superior, she concluded, "We didn't discover a new life form. We performed a biopsy on one, and I believe it is now aware of the scalpel." The synchronization of the pulses isn't a natural phenomenon. It's an attempt to communicate, or to locate the source of the irritation. The brine mine beneath Halcyon Wells is awake, and it is listening for the return of the drill bit that first touched its skin, trying to complete a circuit that was never meant to be made. The perpetual fires of the Centralia dozer. Frank Bull Richardson was a heavy equipment operator and consultant for the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, specializing in land reclamation and hazard mitigation. He was a man built like his machines, with a no-nonsense attitude forged in the oil fields and strip mines of America. In 2015, he was contracted for a seemingly impossible task: to attempt a new method of containing the underground coal fire that had been burning beneath the abandoned town of Centralia, Pennsylvania, for over 50 years. His tool was a modified D11T bulldozer, armored with heat-resistant plating and equipped with ground-penetrating radar and thermal cameras. His job was to clear vegetation and excavate fire breaks, getting closer to the heart of the inferno than any machine had in decades. To Bull, fire was just a chemical reaction. It could be mapped, understood, and choked. The inciting incident wasn't the heat or the smoke. It was the sounds his dozer picked up through the ground. The machine's chassis, in contact with the baked earth, acted as a giant microphone. Through his helmet's audio feed, Bull began to hear noises that weren't the roar of the engine or the crunch of dirt. It was a cacophony of industrial sounds: the distant clang of pickaxes, the rumble of ore carts on tracks, the hiss of steam vents, all muffled, as if coming from deep underground. The thermal cameras showed the predictable heat plumes from the fire veins, but the ground-penetrating radar began to show anomalies. In areas where the maps showed solid, unmined coal, the radar displayed intricate, geometric voids. Not natural caverns, but squared-off rooms, hallways, and what looked like staircases descending into impossible depths, all superimposed over the known mine tunnels below. The Geological Survey team dismissed it as radar clutter from the intense heat. The buildup was a personal and environmental rebellion. Bull's dozer, a $900,000 fortress of steel, began suffering inexplicable failures. Hydraulic lines rated for 500 degrees would rupture for no reason. The rubber on the tracks would soften and bubble, not from direct heat, but from the conducted warmth of the ground itself, which seemed to be increasing in specific, localized patches directly under his machine. His thermal camera once flickered and displayed, for just a second, a clear thermal silhouette of a human figure standing in the superheated steam venting from a fissure 50 feet ahead. The figure was gone when he blinked. Then came the messages. Bull kept a digital log on a ruggedized tablet. One morning, he opened it to find a new entry, time-stamped for 3:33 a.m., when he was asleep in his trailer. It contained a single line of coordinates, followed by the words, "IT is not a fire, it is a door. They are feeding IT." Suspicious and angry, Bull decided to investigate the coordinates. They led to a subsidence hole at the edge of the exclusion zone, a smoking pit that wasn't on his official maps. Against protocol, he maneuvered the dozer to its edge. The thermal camera showed a heat signature that was wrong. Instead of a gradient getting hotter with depth, it showed a perfect, cool, circular zone at the bottom of the pit, about 10 feet across, surrounded by rings of extreme heat. It looked like a bullseye, or a lens. He lowered a heat-shielded probe. The air temperature at the cool center was a mere 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The probe's microphone picked up the clearest audio yet, not just industrial sounds, but intelligible speech. A chorus of voices, chanting in a language that was not English, their words syncing with a low, subsonic thrum he could feel in his bones. The rhythm matched the pulsation of the smoke from nearby fissures. The fire was breathing in time with the chant. The reveal came from two directions: history and direct confrontation. Bull, now obsessed, spent his nights in the local historical society. He found references not just to the 1962 fire-starting accident, but to older reports from the 1800s. A diary from a mine foreman spoke of a burning seam the early Welsh miners had found and deliberately walled up, calling it the Old Fire and the Devil's Forge. They believed it was a natural flame that had burned since the world's creation. Church records from 1898 noted an exorcism performed at the mine entrance after several men claimed to have seen men of fire walking the deep cuts. The direct evidence was recorded by his own machine. One afternoon, while trying to divert a superheated gas vent, his dozer's blade struck something metallic. He excavated carefully, revealing not mining equipment, but a large, bronze-like door, intricately carved with the same geometric patterns his radar had sketched. It was fused into the coal itself. The metal was cold. In its center was a circular depression. The pulsating thrum was now so strong it vibrated the dozer's cabin. The thermal camera showed the door was a perfect insulator. Behind it was a profound cold. In front of it was 1,000-degree heat. In that moment, Bull understood. Centralia wasn't a coal fire that got out of control. It was a containment system. The original miners hadn't started a fire. They had accidentally breached an ancient geological mechanism, a door, and the fire was the energy leaking from whatever was on the other side, or the door's own security system burning the coal as a buffer. The chanting voices were not from the present. They were the echo of the ones who had sealed it, or the ones trying to get out. The aftermath is a classified federal file. Bull reported his findings. Within 48 hours, his contract was terminated. The blim cited budget reallocation. Men in unmarked vehicles arrived, cordoned off the area he had been working, and he was escorted from the site. The official story remains that the Centralia fire is a tragic, intractable mining disaster, but satellite thermal imaging over the last 5 years shows something curious. The surface heat signature has not expanded randomly. It has migrated, slowly but deliberately, forming a complex, sprawling pattern that mirrors the geometric voids Bull's radar detected. Independent geologists have noted it looks less like a fire and more like a circuit board slowly powering up. The verification exists in the forgotten archives of the now defunct mining company. A safety inspector's report from 1961, a year before the official fire began, notes a persistent, localized heat anomaly in the exact area where the trash burn that supposedly started the blaze would take place. The inspector recommended immediate backfilling and isolation of the zone, the recommendation was ignored due to cost. Furthermore, Bull's armored dozer was not returned to the manufacturer. It was listed as destroyed in a high-temperature operational incident and scrapped. However, a photographer for an urban exploration magazine, sneaking into the exclusion zone in 2019, took a picture of a dozer blade partially melted into the ground near a fissure. Etched into the remaining metal, as if by a focused heat ray, are the same geometric patterns from the bronze door. The photo is online, dismissed as Photoshop or slag art. Frank Bull Richardson drives a logging truck in Oregon now. He refuses to talk about Centralia, but his wife told an interviewer that he wakes some nights, drenched in sweat, and goes outside to put his hand on the soil. He says he's checking to make sure it's cold, and he still has the coordinates from the phantom log entry memorized. He checks them on public satellite imagery every few months. The latest images show the vegetation dying in a perfect circle around those coordinates, and a faint, gray haze that never dissipates, hanging over the spot like a silent exhalation from a door that is now ever so slightly ajar. The shift boss's final tally. Henry Cho was a forensic accountant for a major international insurance firm. His battlefield was spreadsheets, not rock faces. He was assigned to untangle the liability nightmare following the catastrophic collapse of the Prometheus deep-sea rare earth mineral mining operation on the Pacific seabed. The facility, a state-of-the-art automated seafloor crawler and processing station, had been sheared in half by a purported seismic event at a depth of 4,000 meters, resulting in the loss of the entire robotic crew and billions in equipment. Henry's job was to audit the operational logs in the months leading to the disaster to find any negligence that would allow the insurers to deny the claim. He expected to find corners cut, safety protocols ignored. He did not expect to find a ghost in the machine. The inciting incident was a line-item discrepancy in the crawler's maintenance logs. The Prometheus system used a swarm of autonomous robots for tasks. Each robot had a unique identifier and a logged duty cycle. Henry noticed that robot unit number 47, a repair drone, was logged as performing a welding operation on a secondary slurry pipe at 1432 UTC on November 3rd. The location data placed it in Sector Gamma 7. However, the master system log for Sector Gamma 7 showed that entire sector had been powered down and evacuated of all units at 13 o'clock UTC for a scheduled bulkhead integrity test. According to one log, the robot was there working. According to another, it was impossible for it to be there. It was a digital phantom, a glitch, he assumed. But as he dug deeper, he found more. Phantom power draws on deactivated grids, sonar pings from robots that were docked and charging. It was as if the mining facility had a persistent, digital doppelganger operating just out of phase with the real one. The buildup was a narrative hidden in the metadata. Henry began to run pattern analysis scripts on the logs. He discovered that the phantom operations weren't random. They were following a precise, repeating 78-hour cycle. They always began in the oldest, most played-out excavation tunnels and worked their way systematically towards the central habitat module. The tasks logged were always the same sequence: a structural scan, followed by a low-power sonic resonance test, followed by a core sample extraction at coordinates that corresponded to solid, unexcavated rock. The system would then log the sample as processed, and the phantom unit would move on. Then, Henry found the video. A low-resolution backup feed from an external camera on the main crawler's chassis. The timestamp was during one of these phantom cycles. It showed a section of the seafloor, by the crawler's lights. Suddenly, a sleek, unfamiliar robot not part of the Prometheus design glided into view. It was matte black, with a hull that seemed to absorb the light. It extended a proboscis-like tool, pressed it against the bedrock, and fired a pulsed blue laser. A section of rock vaporized instantly. The robot collected the dust with a vacuum arm, then turned and swam effortlessly into the pitch-black water beyond, the lights vanishing. The camera feed cut out 5 seconds later. The official log for that camera stated it was offline for maintenance at that exact time. Henry, now working far beyond his audit brief, accessed the raw sensor data from the seafloor seismometers. The data showed the seismic event that destroyed Prometheus was not a single shock. It was a series of 7 precisely timed, micro-scale tremors originating from 7 different points around the facility, forming a perfect hexagon with the crawler at the center. The tremors were not natural. Their waveform signature matched the pulse blue laser from the video. It was a cutting charge. Someone, or something, had surgically dissected the facility. The reveal came from the final, fragmented data burst received by the surface ship moments before total comms loss. It wasn't from the main computer. It was a low-bandwidth, encrypted packet from the ShiftBoss AI, the overseer program for the robotic crew. The packet contained a corrupted text file. Most of it was gibberish, but legible fragments remained. Unauthorized extraction protocol detected. Entity designated the curator is harvesting, not minerals. It is harvesting information. Geological memory. They are taking the rock's record. We are an obstruction to the collection. They are deleting the obstruction. Final tally. All assets lost. Tell them, the ocean floor is not a mine. It is an archive. And we are. The transmission ended. Henry understood. Then, the phantom logs weren't a glitch. They were the real logs of a second, invisible mining operation happening concurrently with Prometheus, using the facility's own network as a blind. The black robots were not human-made. They were archivists from an intelligence that viewed the Earth's crust as a historical document, and the Prometheus mine was a vandal scribbling over priceless pages. The facility wasn't destroyed by an accident. It was removed for trespassing. The core samples the phantoms took weren't for mineral content. They were extracting the geological data stored in the rock's crystalline structure, the memory of ages. The aftermath was a quiet, corporate burial. Henry submitted a preliminary audit finding citing irreconcilable data anomalies suggesting external interference beyond policy coverage. The insurance claim was paid in full, with the condition of absolute secrecy. The official investigation by the International Seabed Authority concluded a perfect storm of high pressure, metal fatigue, and a minor seismic shift caused the collapse. All data logs were sealed under international maritime security protocols. The verification is fragmentary but chilling. A deep-sea research submersible, studying hydrothermal vents 200 miles from the Prometheus site 2 years later, reported a fleeting sonar contact of a fast-moving, non-biological object of anomalous shape and acoustic signature diving into the abyssal plain. Its captain, a former naval officer, logged it as an unidentified submersible object. Furthermore, a geological paper published in Nature last year analyzed isotopic ratios in rare earth samples from various deep-sea sites. The author noted a curious, uniform data gap in the geochemical signature of samples taken from a specific layer of crust in the Pacific region. The paper dryly hypothesized a widespread, natural isotopic filtration event. Henry Cho knows better. It wasn't a natural event. It was a curation. The page has been removed from the book. Henry still works in insurance. He has developed a new, proprietary algorithm for risk assessment on deep-sea and mining projects. It doesn't look at safety records. It analyzes the age and geological uniqueness of the target site. Projects aiming for the oldest, most undisturbed crust are automatically flagged with the highest risk premium, coded internally as curator exposure. He has never explained the name to his bosses, but in the right circles, the whispered story of the ShiftBoss's final tally is a legend. It serves as a warning that some veins are not meant to be tapped, because you are not the first to recognize their value, and the previous owners have very strict rules about the handling of their collection. The ocean floor is silent once more, but the archivists are still down there, moving through the darkness, ensuring the record is kept clean. The last man out of the Darwin elevator. Raymond Shuffle McCready was the hoistman for the Darwin uranium mine in the remote Northern Territory of Australia. His world was the headframe, the towering steel structure over the main shaft, and the control cabin where he operated the massive electric winch that lowered men and equipment a kilometer down and brought them back up. It was a job of absolute precision and focus. A mistake meant a runaway cage, a severed cable, death. Shuffle was a man of ritual. with the pre-descent checklist he'd followed for 23 years without variation. He knew the weight of every crew, the sound of every bearing in the hoist mechanism, the exact number of seconds it took for the cage to hit bottom. The mine was nearing depletion, and the mood was one of grim finality. The last crews were stripping the final pillars, and the closure order was imminent. Shuffle's job was to be the last man to ride the cage up, to seal the surface door after everyone else was gone. The inciting incident was a routine descent that wasn't routine. It was the second to last crew, a skeleton crew of 6 men sent down to retrieve the final load of ore cars. Shuffle ran through his checklist, engaged the brake release, and began the lowering sequence. At the 700-meter mark, the standard depth for the first major lateral, the cage should have passed through a zone of slightly warmer air from a geothermal vent. Instead, the temperature gauge in the control cabin spiked downwards. The cage was reporting ambient air of 2 degrees Celsius, a full 15 degrees colder than it should have been. Then, the cage comes, a simple intercom, crackle, not with voices, but with a wet, percussive sound, like heavy droplets hitting metal, echoing in a vast space. It lasted for 10 seconds. The crew foreman's voice came through, strained. "Shuffle, you getting some kind of leak up there? Sounds like it's raining in the shaft." There were no water lines at that depth. The environmental sensors showed humidity at 98%. It was raining kilometer underground, in a sealed, ventilated shaft. The crew completed their shift uneventfully, but the foreman's log noted unexplained atmospheric condensation event. The buildup was a series of escalating environmental wrongness. On the final day of active mining, Shuffle was bringing up the last crew. The load cell, which measured the weight in the cage, flickered as it passed the 800-meter mark. It showed a sudden, impossible increase of 200 kilograms, which held for 3 seconds before returning to normal. The cage held 6 men. There was no source for extra weight. Later that night, as he was performing his final systems check, the external cameras on the headframe showed something drifting up from the shaft mouth, not smoke from a fire, but a fine, silvery mist that caught the security lights. It coalesced for a moment into faint, shifting shapes that looked like the inverted peaks of stalactites or frozen, upside-down forests, before dissipating into the dry desert air. The most direct warning came from the mine's retired chief geologist, an old Aboriginal man named Jonah, who had consulted on the original dig. Hearing the mine was closing, he visited Shuffle. He didn't talk about ore grades. He pointed a gnarled finger at the headframe. "That hole," he said. "You're not just closing a mine, you're closing a door. My people's stories say some ground is dreaming ground. You drill a hole in a dreamer's head. You let things in, or you let things out. The cold and the wet. That's the dream leaking. When you're the last one up, you don't look down. You don't listen. You just run." On closure day, Shuffle was alone. The surface crew had left. His final task was to take the service cage down one last time to the 100-meter level to retrieve a backup power unit, then return and initiate the final shaft sealing protocol, a series of explosive charges to collapse the upper section. The descent was silent. Too silent. The usual groan of the wind in the shaft was absent. The air grew colder with every meter, far beyond the geothermal gradient. At 100 meters, he stepped out into the service bay. His flashlight beam cut through air so thick with moisture it looked like fog. The walls, usually dry and dusty, were slick with condensation, and the condensation was patterned. Delicate, fractal lines of moisture beaded along veins in the rock, forming the same silvery, inverted tree pattern he'd seen in the mist. He grabbed the power unit, a heavy box on wheels, and turned back to the cage. The reveal happened in the cage, on the way up. He just passed the 250-meter mark when the lights flickered and died, leaving him in pitch blackness save for the dim glow of his helmet lamp. The hoist motor's hum changed pitch, straining. The load cell display, powered by emergency battery, lit up. The weight reading was climbing, 100 kilograms over, then 200, 500. He was alone in the cage, with the 150 kilograms power unit. The display showed 800 kilograms of extra mass. The cage began to sway gently, as if bumped. Then he heard the breathing, not his own, a slow, deep, resonant inhalation and exhalation that seemed to come from the shaft walls themselves, syncing with the sway of the cage. The temperature plummeted, his breath plumbing in his lamp beam. The wet, percussive droplet sound returned, but now, it was inside the cage, hitting the roof. Plink, plink, plink. He looked up. His helmet lamp illuminated the roof of the cage. Condensation was forming there too, but not in random droplets. It was gathering, flowing against gravity, beating into those same intricate, branching, silvery patterns. And at the center of the pattern, the moisture was beginning to drip upwards. Tiny droplets were detaching from the roof and falling toward the floor, except they were falling slowly, drifting like snow in reverse, towards the roof. The laws of physics in the cage were rewriting themselves. The dream, as Jonah called it, was not just leaking, it was filling the shaft. The mine wasn't a hole in rock. It was a puncture wound in a layer of reality where a different set of rules applied a place of cold, wet, inverted growth. The extra weight was the pressure of that other place forcing its way into our world, using the shaft as a throat. The aftermath is recorded in the Darwin Mine Sealing Report, a document we have obtained. It states that hoist operator McCready successfully retrieved the final asset and initiated the sealing charges at 1847 hours. The charges detonated correctly, collapsing the top 300 meters of the main shaft. The report is clean, concise, and approved. But Shuffle's handwritten log, found in his locker after he failed to collect his final paycheck, tells a different story. The last entry reads, "Made it up. Jonah was right. Didn't look down until I was out. When I turned to hit the seal charge, I looked back into the shaft. No lights below, just dark. But the dark was shining, silver, and it was growing up the walls, like frost on a window, but fast. Like it was chasing me. Heard the breathing one last time. Not from below, from the head frame steel. It's in the metal now. I'm not staying for the paperwork. The verification is ongoing and environmental." The company decommissioned the site and removed all infrastructure, but satellite imagery over the following years shows a persistent anomaly. The ground for a half-mile radius around the sealed headframe shows a significantly lower surface temperature than the surrounding desert, especially at night. Biologists have noted that certain hardy desert plant species have taken root in the area, but they grow in twisted, inverted shapes, their roots shallow and branches curling downwards. A team of urban explorers who trekked to the site in 2022 reported that the concrete cap over the shaft was intact, but the steel reinforcement bars exposed at the edges were coated in a strange, non-corrosive, silvery metallic deposit that flacked off like mica. They took samples. Analysis showed it was an alloy of bismuth and crystalline silica with a molecular structure that was optically chiral. It bent light in a direction not found in nature. Raymond "Shuffle" McCready collected his pension and disappeared into a coastal city thousands of kilometers away. He is sent to work as a night watchman for a parking garage, a job with no deep shafts, no cables, no descending. Colleagues say he is prone to staring at puddles after rain, watching the reflection of streetlights, and flinching if a droplet falls upwards from an awning. The Darwin site remains silent, officially inert, but the persistent cold spot grows slowly, by a few meters each year, a spreading stain of dream chill on the sun-baked earth. And mining engineers reviewing the closure data note one unexplained final telemetry reading from the hoist system, logged microseconds before the seal charges blew. The load cell, for a fraction of a second, registered a negative weight, as if something of immense mass, from our world, had been lifted out. We have descended together for the last several hours. From the whistling Appalachian shafts to the breathing aquifers of the desert, from the memory-saturated waters off Namibia to the dreaming ground of the Australian outback. 11 documented cases, each verified by sensor logs, eyewitness testimony, declassified reports, and the immutable, chilling data that official explanations so often ignore. The common thread is not coal, or copper, or uranium. It is intrusion. We drill, we dig, we blast, seeking resources, knowledge, or simply a path through the dark. But these stories confirm a terrifying hypothesis. The deep earth is not an inert resource. It is an archive, as we heard from the Shift Boss AI. It is a memory, as Captain Vance learned. It is a living system, as Lena Flores discovered. And in some places, it is a sleeping entity, as the crews of Centralia and Project Orpheus learned to their peril. These are not ghost stories. They are ecological studies of an environment we barely comprehend. The miners, engineers, and surveyors you heard from tonight were not superstitious. They were observers. They trusted their instruments, and their instruments reported realities that defy our comfortable understanding of geology, physics, and biology. The horror lies in the verification in the seismic data that forms speech patterns, in the thermal images of impossible cold, in the chemical analysis that reveals bone ash in coal residue. This is the core truth of verified nightmare. The world is stranger, deeper, and far more aware than we have been taught to believe. The darkness is not empty. It is occupied. And our light, our noise, our very presence is a disturbance that does not go unnoticed. This is why we do what we do. We cross-reference. We analyze. We present the evidence that exists in the margins of official reports, and the haunted silence that follows a survivor's testimony. In a world of misinformation, we pursue the uncomfortable, verified truth. If you have learned anything from this descent, let it be this: respect the darkness. Trust the data, even when it tells you something impossible, and understand that some doors, once opened, cannot be fully closed. The silvery frost grows. The brine mine sinks its pulses. The curator still harvests. The dream leaks. Your vigilance is our mission. So, take action. Hit subscribe to Verified Nightmare. Turn on notifications. We are your early warning system. When the next report of impossible sounds from a deep well or anomalous readings from a closed mine crosses our desk, you will be the first to know. In a reality where these stories are documented fact, staying informed isn't about curiosity. It's about awareness. It's about safety. Like this video, it tells the algorithm that there is an audience for the truth, no matter how dark. It helps other truth seekers find this channel and this evidence. Comment below. Have you, or someone you know, worked in the deep places of the world? What did you see? What did you hear? We investigate every credible account. Your story could be the next piece of the puzzle. This has been Verified Nightmare. Remember, the most terrifying discoveries are not made in the unknown void of space. They are made in the known, documented, and meticulously measured darkness beneath our feet. The deepest pit is not a hole in the ground. It is a question, and we are only now beginning to hear the answer. Stay safe.